Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on a topic, well, it's a really tough one, to be honest. We're going to be looking at child exploitation rings and how they were able to operate in the UK for decades, really. It's heavy stuff, no doubt, but, it's one of those things that we can't shy away from, right? We're going to try to sort of break down how it happened, why it happened, and what can be done to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Absolutely. It's a really complex issue. Lots of layers to unpack, and it's so important to talk about it with nuance and with sensitivity. So yeah, I'm ready to dive in if you are.
All right, let's do it. Let's set the scene first, okay? Yeah. We're mainly talking about towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, Telford, Oldham, places that have unfortunately become pretty much synonymous with these awful crimes. Can you give us a little bit of background here, kind of a timeline of what went on and just the sheer scale of it all?
Yeah, so we're really looking at a pattern of exploitation that goes back, decades. Some of the cases that came to light, they were surfacing in the late 90s and the early 2000s, but so often these cases went unreported or like unaddressed for years, and the scale of it it's staggering. I mean, in Rotherham alone, just one town, there was a 2014 inquiry, and they estimated that there were at least 1,400 children abused over a period of 16 years.
1,400 children, just in one town. I mean, that number is just... It's hard to even wrap your head around it. We're not just talking about isolated incidents here, though, are we?
No, not at all. This was organized. I mean, these were organized rings, often operating with this, a horrifying level of sophistication. They would target vulnerable children, a lot of times using tactics like grooming, It's where they would build trust and offer gifts or attention and things like that. They were master manipulators and they were exploiting these kids. And the abuse, we're talking sexual violence, trafficking, and extreme psychological coercion as well. It's just awful.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to believe that something like this, so horrific, it could go on for so long and seemingly undetected. What went wrong here? Mm-hmm. How was it possible that these rings were able to operate so openly for so long?
I think that's the question that haunts everyone who looks into this issue. And I think what the research really points to is a systemic breakdown. Yeah. At multiple levels. We see failures in governance, in policing, and in social services. It seems like there was this collective inability or maybe an unwillingness to recognize and address what was happening.
So were there specific cases that really exemplify these failures?
Yeah.
Where there are opportunities to step in and these weren't taken?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, there are many. One that's particularly disturbing is from Rotherham. There was this young girl who reported, being abused repeatedly to social workers. But instead of taking her seriously, they labeled her as promiscuous and they dismissed her claims. And that dismissal, it had devastating consequences. It allowed the abuse to just go on for years.
It's just... It's unfathomable that, that professionals who are tasked with protecting children could fail so badly. But it wasn't just individual negligence, was it? There were larger societal factors at play here, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A lot of the research suggests that there were these underlying fears of exacerbating racial tensions or even facing accusations of prejudice. And that might have really influenced the decision making, In some areas, the perpetrators were predominantly of South Asian origin, and there's evidence that authorities hesitated to address the issue, because of this fear of being labeled as racist.
So almost like they were so afraid of making, one problem worse, that they essentially allowed a completely different one to fester and grow. It's like a chilling example of how, political correctness and these political considerations can have such real world consequences, and especially for the people who are the most vulnerable.
Exactly, yeah, and I think it highlights this dangerous paradox, really, because the very systems that are meant to protect vulnerable communities can become barriers to justice when fear and political expediency end up taking precedence over truth and over action. It's kind of backwards.
So, given the the enormous scale of these crimes and all the systemic failures that you've been talking about, what's the response been like from the legal and justice system? Have they stepped up? Have they done what they're supposed to do?
Well, there have been prosecutions, and some of them have even resulted in, lengthy prison sentences. But there are many, many people who feel that the sentences just they don't go far enough. They don't really reflect the severity of the crimes or the lifelong trauma that's been inflicted on the survivors. And then there's the issue of delayed justice as well. A lot of these cases took years, even decades, to come to light, and that just makes prosecution so much more difficult, and it just compounds the suffering of the survivors.
Right. So it sounds like it's like navigating the justice system just becomes this added layer of difficulty for the survivors.
Yeah.
What about support outside the legal system? What resources are available to people who have experienced this kind of trauma?
Yeah. Luckily, there are organizations that are dedicated to supporting survivors of child sexual abuse, and they offer counseling and therapy and advocacy services, which is so important. But access to these services, I mean, it's inconsistent, and a lot of survivors, they just face so many barriers to seeking help in the first place, like stigma and shame and even just this fear that people won't believe them. I mean, the long-term impact of this kind of abuse it's profound, Survivors, they often struggle with mental health issues, like PTSD, anxiety, depression. They have difficulty, forming healthy relationships. It affects their whole lives.
It's also unsettling to hear about, to be honest with you. I mean, we've uncovered this horrific pattern of abuse, and the systemic failure to protect children, and just this long and difficult road to any kind of justice for the survivors. Are there any signs of hope here? I mean, what's being done? Yeah. To try to ensure that something like this just never happens again?
Well, I do think in the aftermath of all of these scandals, there have been policy changes, and there have been some initiatives that are aimed at strengthening the child protection systems, and these include things like mandatory reporting guidelines for professionals, and improved training for police officers and for social workers, and a lot of effort is being put into fostering better communication and information sharing between agencies so that people can, work together more efficiently. And there's also, I think, a much greater emphasis now on early intervention and really, really trying to identify at-risk children so that, that this can be addressed before anything bad happens.
I mean, these changes all sound, they sound promising, but
yeah.
But is it enough? I mean, how can we be sure that the lessons from the past are actually being learned and that they're actually being applied?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Policies and procedures, they're important, they're a starting point, but they can only go so far. I think what we really need to address are the underlying societal issues that contribute to exploitation in the first place. Things like poverty and inequality, lack of education, and just this normalization of harmful attitudes towards women and towards children. We've got to create a culture where children are truly seen and heard and valued, and where speaking up about abuse is met with support and with belief, not with dismissal and judgment.
Yeah, you've given us a lot to think about here. This deep dive has been incredibly, incredibly informative, but it's definitely been disturbing too. I mean, the scale of abuse, the systemic failures, the lasting trauma, it's a lot to process, to be honest. But as you said, we can't look away. What would you say is the single most important takeaway from all of this? If our listeners remember one thing, what should it be?
Well, I think the most important takeaway really is the need for vigilance. We all have a responsibility to be aware of the signs of child exploitation, to speak up if we see something concerning, and to support organizations that are working to protect children. We can't rely solely on institutions to solve this problem. It takes a collective effort. It takes a societal shift in attitudes and in behaviors to really ensure the safety and the well-being of children.
That's a powerful message. I mean, it's a call to action to all of us, really. This deep dive has been a stark reminder of just how important awareness is and understanding and action when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable members of our society. So let's all commit to doing our part to making that difference. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time on the deep dive.